going to go over kind of what it is, how to do it, and then some considerations within that. And just some quick notes, just to be transparent. This is being recorded, and you can watch it in about a few days or so. Your video and names will not be part of that, though, so keep that in mind. If you are not actively speaking, please keep yourself on mute if possible. If any questions come up, definitely feel free to throw them in the chat and I will get to them when there's an open spot. Feel free to speak up as well. Definitely do not feel pressure to speak though. I'm gonna, I'm gonna create some time to talk, but if you don't want to talk, totally fine. At the end, I will kind of show you some resources and upcoming webinars that are coming up as well. Okay, so again, I just want to quickly go over what to expect. So I'm going to go over what student self-assessment is. And all of this is based off empirical articles I found. So it's not just me kind of thinking of, hey, this is what it is. Detail its benefits according to research. Talk about how to actually implement it in the classroom, and then give you some kind of more nuanced considerations that may be helpful in that implementation. So first off, I guess I just want to get a sense of what is everyone's interest in this topic yourself. If you've used it, I'd love to hear your experiences with it, either as a student or as an educator. How does it influence your idea of education? Really, I just kind of want to leave this space open to better understand what kind of made you want to learn about it. And again, you can speak up in chat and here or in chat, doesn't matter, or not at all. Okay, so we had someone say that they want to be able to use this technique in the future, both in classes and possibly in evaluation work, which is really interesting. I haven't thought about the evaluation perspective. But that is really nice to hear. I think this is very heavily focused on how to actually implement this and the processes of what that looks like. So I think it will be helpful in that way. I'm interested in ways to account for diversity of learning and various learning modes. That is great. Yeah, I hope this will be really helpful in that way as well, because it is definitely I think this is a radically different approach to education. And that was definitely my interest in it itself.
If I could chime in,
yeah.
Thinking about those questions, I felt like I was never involved in assessing my work, that it was strictly the teacher's role to do that. So it always left me in a state of having to gauge which teacher grades in which way. And it was a little bit confusing because I never knew if my work would get an A or a B or what was just how to deal with it. And it just seemed very vague. Assessment seemed vague to me as a student. So yeah, it just felt like I was not involved in the assessment. I was just told it either met the mark or it didn't. And that was that.
Yeah. And, I had the same experience. It didn't even come across my radar that it was possible for students to have any say in grading itself. It was really only until I started teaching a little that seemed kind of what I thought education should be, that it should be this co-collaboration between teacher and student and figuring out how to better improve your students. very interested in this approach moving forward in the classroom, of course, but also in scholarly circles as an idea that might shape communication and engagement. I don't recall ever having this in my own classes and courses, but of course, I wish I did. Yeah, it's the same. I didn't know this is possible. So that is, again, definitely one of my main interests in it. Okay, so just at its very base, what is it? Essentially, what you are doing is you are working with your student to determine their grade. Now, the extent to which they are involved in this process is up to you. So they may be very heavily involved or they may be minimally involved. That is entirely up to you. So there's a lot of leniency in that. But the kind of key thing, what it's trying to do, essentially, what this approach, if you choose to go this route, what you are trying to do is you're trying to get your students to become skilled in self-assessment, of evaluating where they are in their own development. So generally what you're talking about is you're talking about students are monitoring and evaluating the quality of their own thinking and behavior while learning. So it's a lot of reflection, a lot of this is what I did, this is what I got, here's how I thought about this, how can I improve upon that? And then upon that evaluation, you're identifying strategies that improve their understanding and skills. And from a research article, I thought this was a helpful way to think about it as this cyclical process of self-judgment, identifying learning targets, and then self-monitoring. And it just kind of goes around. So you're really you're building metacognitive skills in your students, or you're at least attempting to, which is just something I think in general, education tends to focus on obedience. And this is a radically different approach to that. Does that make sense? Are there any questions on that? And feel free to throw them in chat if there are. Okay. So, of course, no one class or anything like that will create a specific type of student. But I think when you choose student self-assessment as your kind of model, what you're valuing are certain characteristics in a student, because this is what you're trying to build. So within that, I think what you're trying to build is someone who is able to learn on their own without your assistance. You're essentially a Sherpa of education, something like that. You're building self-motivation within the student, ideally, because they're so involved in the learning process with you. And of course, with that approach, you're going to build confidence in their student, because it doesn't feel, as Catherine said, hopefully it's not going to feel so random about why I got this grade. Why they got their grade is, well, you're going to have intense conversations with them about how you got to where you are. And maybe your thoughts about their work ethic or whatever it is clarified by those conversations. So it becomes a very it is very co-collaborative in that way. And of course, you're asking your students to be incredibly reflexive in their thinking. So inherently in this process is you're always asking your students to think about their own thinking all the time. I mean, this becomes maybe the most important part of this process. So that is essentially what you're trying to foster by using this approach. I think some considerations that they're not negatives, certainly, but they're just things to keep in mind. So let's say that I'm going to rely on my students' evaluations of themselves a lot in the approach I'm taking. Well, inherent in that process is you may not agree with your students' assessment of themselves, both positively and negatively. One thing to keep in mind is that underserved students, and so women and minorities tend to underrate themselves consistently, according to research. So it's something to look for when you're conducting this approach. But again, I mean, this is where your voice becomes important in that discussion. It's not like they have full reign over whatever grade they get. You have a say in that, but they are very much part of that process with you. As with any approach, I think you can argue that some students may take advantage of the system. So when you're having these discussions, a common approach within this is, I want you to detail what you did to produce this work. Take me through your process, take me through your thoughts. It is possible that some students will fabricate this. And I think with anything we do in the classroom, it's a trade-off. So maybe some students take advantage of the system, but we are building kind of self-starters in the classroom. Are you willing to take that trade-off? I personally am very okay with that trade-off, because I think I'm helping build what education should be, in my opinion. It may not be something you're interested in letting slide. That is up to you, but it is worth considering. Does your administration allow it? It's something to consider. In my teaching experience, this hasn't been much of an issue. And I will stress that when your students are very much involved in their own grades and working with you in that manner, there is a lot of, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of flexibility in that. So the extent to which they are involved, you can mess with. And I think you can make it so your administration will allow it, but it is something to consider. And lastly, I kind of want to stress this. So I don't know within this hour that you're going to become an expert in this. I don't think I'm an expert in this. And research articles that I've read have really stressed that if the educator has a kind of shallow understanding of the process, then that will likely translate to the students as well. So if you are going to implement this, it takes a lot of work on the front end, understanding how to set this up. And it does take, it's definitely front heavy. But you're building something worthwhile, in my opinion. So I wanted to show you this quick video. I think it's about 5 minutes. And I think it does a really nice job of just kind of showing what self-assessment is, how often we do it in everyday life, and then some ways that you can use it in the classroom. And then I'll talk about that more afterwards. Can you hear that? Good.
Assessment is all around us. If you're a skater at a skate park, you're engaging in self-assessment every time you reflect on your progress and plan your next steps. If you're a runner training for a marathon, you look at time splits and compare it to your goals. If you're a musician, you're engaging in assessment every time you listen to yourself play and make modifications to your approach. As an author, you engage in self-assessment when you revise your work. And it's not always individual. Often assessment will happen in community. If you're a chef, you're engaging in peer assessment when you ask a trusted fellow chef, how does this taste? If you're an artist, you might ask for an extra set of eyes on a particular project. If you're an engineer, you might observe users to see if your design is working. And if you do any kind of creative work, both self-assessment and peer assessment are vital for improving your craft. It helps you refine your process and helps you improve your products. Assessment helps us figure out what we know, what we don't know, and what steps we need to take in the future to master a skill or understand a concept at a deeper level. Okay, but what does this mean in the classroom? Well, it starts with self-assessment. Here, students engage in goal setting, where they set goals, plan their approach, and keep track of the progress. They also engage in self-reflections. Here, they can reflect on the learning process, but also focus on the strengths and weaknesses of their products, which then leads to new iterations. A similar option is a student survey with multiple choice, checkboxes, and Likert scales. In some cases, students might use a self-assessment rubric. Students are able to look at the progression from emerging to mastery with specific descriptions in various categories. They are able to gain an accurate view on what they are doing while also having a clear picture of where they need to be. Students might also use checklists. These can be a powerful diagnostic tool that students use before, during, and after a specific task. When projects are done, they can present their work in a portfolio where they reflect on what they've learned. Peer assessment is also important. One option is the 10-minute peer feedback system. This begins with one student sharing their work or pitching an idea while the other student actively listens. It then moves to a chance to ask clarifying questions, get feedback, respond to feedback, and chart out your next steps. Another option is structured feedback with sentence stems. This is especially helpful for ELL students. Or you could use the 3-2-1 structure. Now, this is simple. Students provide 3 strengths, 2 areas of improvement, and 1 question that they still have. Another option is the peer feedback carousel. Here, each group has a stack of sticky notes, and they offer anonymous feedback as they move from group to group to group. Or you could keep it more open-ended with peer coaching. Students interview each other about the process, they guide reflection, and they provide feedback. Now, we often think of classroom assessment as a conversation between teachers and students. But in life, students won't always have a teacher to grade their work or give them necessary feedback. And this is why we need self-assessment and peer assessment every day. The more we can integrate this into our lessons, the better prepared students will be for the creative life.
Okay. So, hold on. Are there any questions about that for the time being? Good. Okay, so give me 1 second to recalibrate everything. I think the thing I want to stress about that video, I think it does a really nice job of breaking down kind of what you are trying to build. The one thing I'll mention towards the end, it talks a lot about peer assessment and the value in that. And there's a lot of value in that. But that is generally a more advanced approach to this. So students that don't have that much, I guess, experience with student self-assessment, and speaking from my experience, I've had 0. I never had that as a student. You're going to start off where the teacher is really guiding the students through assessment. The more skilled they get at that, ideally, you would love to have it more student-driven and more peer assessment. But when you're beginning this process, it is going to be more teacher-driven. And then hopefully, as they get better, you kind of lay your hands off a bit. So when you look at the research related to this, it is quite interesting in my opinion, and definitely makes some sense. So from the research, there's a ton of benefits from taking this approach. And I'll talk about at the end some things that can negate some of these benefits, but just if it's done well, you are enhancing student achievement and motivation. Why is that? Well, you're asking your students to become very involved in their own learning process and take control of that, which is just not typical of most classrooms I've seen. So inherent in that process is, well, they're going to become more invested because they have to. You're also assisting in the ability to self-monitor and self-evaluate. So they become better at understanding, oh, my weakness is here. This is how I can improve it. And obviously, this is these are skills that are really important to people outside of the classroom. And it latches on, just as someone who reads a decent amount about habits, it latches on very well to habit research about how to maintain habits, how to kind of create small habits for kind of big changes. I've heard it said. Um, Students are going to actively construct their knowledge and take control of the learning process, so they'll be more hands-on. Um, as a student that has said, I don't understand the point of this course several times in well, more than several, a lot in my life, it is not always easy to see your growth throughout a course. And with taking this approach, since you're always building, um, you can really easily see your growth throughout the course, which can build self-efficacy. And I think the benefit as an educator that I didn't think of myself when I was getting into this or researching this, but it does ask you to become more skilled in scaffolding your students and guiding your students towards achievement rather than telling them what to do. And that is a different approach than I guess I'm used to as well. So you're really focusing on, this is where you are, this is where you need to be. Let me help you identify what tactics we need to do to get you to this. And of course, you can do this in any kind of structure, but this really facilitates that process a lot. So next, I've been talking about the benefits. I want to talk about what this actually looks like. And if you're going to, you say you want this in your classroom, what does it look like? Just looking at this chart, there's kind of 4 steps. 1, develop criteria, which I'll talk about in more detail. 2, provide students with models of success. Then provide detailed feedback on student work that you get. And then identify small goals and strategies to achieve success. The way I like to think about it is these first 2 is you're building a kind of knowledge base within your students. And then the next 2 is you're kind of constantly recalibrating with your students. So you're at this point, we want to get you here, what can we do? And these first 2 sections may feel like, I don't know, you want to rush through them a little, but it's really, really important to spend a lot of time building that knowledge base. So then those next 2 steps will come more easily. Are there any questions regarding that quickly before I get into more detail of what this looks like? Okay, so you want to kind of do this. What does it look like? All right, so developing criteria. So what this section is focused on is how will you be graded, and focusing on what does good work look like. I think the benefit of this section, or what you want to do, is you hope that students find their attachment to the material here, because you want to create guiding questions that suggest you find this stuff in your life all the time. So if you want them to kind of write a good essay, well, let them find an essay that they like in their kind of everyday life that they've read and bring it to class. And then then you start thinking about, what is good about this? Why does it move me in this way? And again, a key component to making this work is kind of the extent to which your students have previous exposure to this topic will influence how involved you are. So, if they are writing all the time and they're reading pieces of literature all the time, well, they can better bring things to the table than someone that's a one-on-one student and hasn't done that. So that's something you as an educator will have to gauge. in the beginning. So what is your exposure to the topic? And that will help you gauge how to conduct this sort of formula. So again, I want to stress that you really want to give them time to find quality pieces of work and let them analyze it. What's good about it? What's not? What kind of made you move? What didn't? And then once you kind of give them time to do that, both individually and collectively, you come together and develop the criteria. So this is what's a good piece of work. This is what's not. And you discuss that as a class. So this level of intentionality will pay dividends later on. And if you want to read kind of more about that process, there are definitely some references I have at the end that will be helpful in that regard. So you've spent time to develop criteria. You have an idea of what good work looks like. What's the next step? So you have this vague idea, but you want to make it more concrete. So you want to provide students with models of what success looks like. And part of that is also giving your students unsuccessful pieces of work. You want to take these abstract ideas about good and give them models of success. And the better they understand that process, and again, you want to spend a lot of time here, the better they understand about what that looks like, multiple pieces of work, seeing it again, that'll pay off in the end when you're trying to recalibrate them for them to model that success. And ideally, you want students to have a connection to the project and understand where they're going and what they need to do to get there. I think when I talk about work on the front end, this is finding those pieces of work and seeing what's acceptable for students and what makes sense for them. That can definitely take some time. But again, I think you spend time on the front end, it'll help you on the back end. So these first two steps, any questions or uncertainties there? Does anyone have experience doing this? Okay. Okay, so we've spent this time kind of building the foundational knowledge. So they know what success looks like. They have concrete examples of that. So now they bring you a piece of work. You say, all right, you know what it looks like. Create something and we'll talk about it. You will save time. I mean, you're not going to be giving a lot of tests necessarily. This is a very formative process. So what I mean by that is this is very feedback heavy. So you don't want to give like generic piece of advice. You're going to be spending a lot of time on giving feedback. And what you're focusing on is, this is where my student is, and I want them to be here. And I think the nice part about this approach is that it's going to normalize mistakes and normalize failure, which is something that our education system doesn't do a great job of often. So it's expected along the road that you're going to make mistakes, but we want to see you bounce back, and we want you, how can I help you get to be successful? Depending where you are and how many students you have, I think one-on-one meetings are really helpful here, or one-on meetings with small groups of people, just so you can give very individualized feedback and understand how your students got to A to B and where the kind of mistakes in thinking occurred. And that's not always easy when you're communicating through email or kind of communicating through only giving feedback on a paper and not hearing their retort quickly. So you have that meeting, and you provide your students with clear and detailed steps on how to reach those objectives. And you may go through several iterations of this. This is not just a one-time thing. But again, this is very feedback heavy, but it's also very personalized. And I think in terms of building community in your classroom, it will be very helpful in that way as well. And the last section of what you're trying to do here is you've given feedback, so you need to improve your sentence structure. Well, how do I do that? So you're identifying small goals and strategies to achieve success. So where do you want them to go? How do they get there again? And as I mentioned before, these goals are going to largely be dictated by the teachers to begin with. But ideally, the further you get along in the semester, you hope that your students are able to identify those next steps more easily. And that is the goal of this approach. Because the more we see our students be able to identify those next steps, the better we know that they know the material and they are set up once they leave our class, not just in it. And for just a very, I don't know, popular, but what you see a lot in this approach to help kind of get to this outcome is reflection journals, process journals. So what was your process to create this? And then I'll look at that and say, well, you can do this, and maybe that will help you. By asking our students to kind of constantly reflect on what they're doing, we can better identify, well, where did they kind of mess up? Where can they improve? So this is very, very, very process driven. And in order for us to understand their process, we need to ask them to keep log of that and keep track of that. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, I found this kind of chart. And so it essentially details, if you want to implement this approach, kind of a beginner's way to do this, and ideally where you would like to get. And more or less, I'll give you a minute just to kind of read through it. But the general theme across this chart is, again, you really want students to drive this process in the end. So you want them to understand, be able to identify what success looks like, find their own examples, understand where they went wrong, and be able to self-correct on their own. And of course, there's some things that will influence their ability to do that. But again, as you kind of work on this with your students, hopefully you will begin developing those skills in them. And I think this is a really beneficial approach for them. Are there any questions regarding this? And just a few additional considerations, and this is kind of the last section I have on implementation, and then I will kind of leave the door open if anyone wants to discuss anything. But so there have been some studies that look at level of agreement between teacher and student on what final grade they think they deserve. And a few things that do influence that level of agreement is level of exposure to the topic area. So it isn't that a freshman and junior are necessarily different, but students in a 101 class versus a capstone, let's say, the capstone students will tend to understand what it is teachers are looking for, what it is that's quality work, and have better agreement with the teacher on that. Also, STEM field classes, there tends to be more agreement between teacher and student there. That doesn't mean it can't be implemented elsewhere, but you have to work on operationalizing your terms a lot in other fields. Secondly, inherent in this process is your building skills. So you're not necessarily say you are a finished product and I want to evaluate that end product necessarily. So there's better success when your assignments are formative in nature. So you're building and building and building, rather than summative, saying, this is where you are, I want to evaluate that. So that's another consideration. Thirdly, hold on. I was just reading the chat. Maybe the most necessary skill here is transparency and clear communication throughout this process is incredibly important. Every thought that you have as a teacher needs to be communicated to your students. What you're looking for in every piece of work, that needs to be communicated to your students. And research looking at transparency in the classroom, it has been shown to be especially helpful for students that were underserved. So that becomes something to have on the top of your mind at all times. Am I communicating what it is that I'm thinking throughout this process? Again, criteria and goals should be concrete and specific. That's part of the transparency aspect. And Catherine, who actually has implemented this in her classroom, she suggested that creating a checklist for self-grading can be really helpful in this approach. Catherine, I don't know if you have anything to speak to it with your experience regarding it, but I thought that was interesting to hear.
Yes, my approach, I teach freshman composition, and it speaks to what you have been saying throughout about the process and being transparent. I just have an honest conversation. I say, okay, this is what I do when I am evaluating your papers. This is what I look for. And from that, I develop just a checklist that students then can take with them. Like, check your thesis. Does it have an argument? Does it have your point? Does it answer this question? Does your topic, sentence do this? So, do you have a quote as your topic sentence, which I tell them they can't do. So it's helpful that they have something tangible to just look at and work through as they're checking their own work. And I make it part of a peer review. I make it part of a class activity. So I try to get them as an adjunct. Wherever I can reduce my grading load, I'm happy. So I try to get them to think like a teacher.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good idea. I've seen in the video they mentioned rubrics, so students kind of check along about what good work looks like, and I can kind of make a check. I did this, I did this, I did this, and that can kind of help facilitate the process of them understanding where they want to go. If you're interested in, again, shallow understanding will tend to lead to shallow implementation. Here's some of the research I came across. Feel free to take a look. I think it's really quite interesting, and there's a fair amount on it. This will be available on our website if you want to get another look. And if you want to keep in contact, here are some ways to do so. We have Instagram, Twitter, email. You can make appointments with us to kind of talk about how you'd want to implement this. And some upcoming webinars that are coming up. And I'm going to launch this poll quickly. If you don't mind taking it, that would be extremely helpful. And I am going to stick around if anyone wants to talk a bit more on this. There is a question. What are additional specific ways to motivate students to engage if they can't, don't want to, are not used to this kind of classroom experience? That is a great question. Well, I think you may shell shock some students, definitely, from the start. So this is where it becomes really, really important, in my opinion, at least, that it is clear about what this process looks like to students. So the fact that they're not used to it isn't going to freak them out once you have several conversations about what this looks like. And I think what's really nice about this is there's an aspect of the framework self-motivates because they're so engaged in their own knowledge construction. And because you're allowing them to find work that they like in everyday life. Like, I found this essay that I really like. Well, all right, you really like that. Why did you really like that? So I think there's a level of kind of autonomy built into it that ideally will self-motivate more than a lot of other approaches I've come across. Any other questions? Feel free to throw them in chat. For this process to work, there needs to be trust established among teachers, administrators, students, and parents. Besides transparency and communication, what other factors need to be considered in order to create a classroom environment that generates and maintains trust and credibility? That is a loaded question. Yeah, I completely agree. I can't speak to specific techniques within, I guess, this structure necessarily, but I think you just have to maintain like a level of, I think this is where transparency is really, I can't speak to the admin part, so I don't have that much experience, creating trust with administrations. I do have experience creating, at least I hope I do, creating trust with students. And I think just transparency has been super important to my process and gaining their trust. Like, they know what I'm looking for. They know I'm very consistent in being empathetic towards, they have something come up, I have flexible deadlines. Like, they know I'm not trying to penalize them. It seems very clear from my experience that they know I'm looking out for them. And that's helped me build trust and credibility with them. I'm sure other people have different experiences. And again, I am definitely not an expert in the admin part. So I can just speak to the students. And that's been my experience. I think transparency is really important.
If I can jump in,
Yeah.
what has helped me, for some reason, the students always seem to like it when they feel like they're getting inside information. And so when I say, listen, I'm going to let you in on a secret about what teachers are doing with your work, this is what we do. And for some reason, they like this idea that I pulled back the curtain a little bit to show them what's going on beyond what they're working on. And then sometimes I joke around, I'm like, no, don't, share this with other professors or admin, because then it's going to go away. And they kind of go, okay, yeah, it's our secret. And then I get their buy-in a little bit more because they feel like I'm trusting them with something that maybe they haven't had access to. So I don't know, it just kind of changes a little bit when I do that. So I don't know, try it. Say, hey, I'm going to let you in on this little secret about how teachers grade. So let's do it. Sometimes it helps.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, students are so freaked out by grades. I think inherent in this process is you're letting them into their own grading process. I think that should build trust naturally to some extent. Yes, the dinosaurs. God, Catherine, I don't know. I mean, I think it's very easy to justify this to any reasonable person because, again, if they are, I can't imagine someone being so against you kind of involving them in the learning process. And I think there's ways to talk about this where it isn't as radical as I actually think it is. It is simply letting them know how they're being graded and taking a process-driven approach. So I think in terms of the admin thing, I think a lot of this ends up being language, about what language they're comfortable with, maybe not saying they're self-grading, even though you are doing that, but, reflective journals, process-driven journals, stuff like that.
Thank you, Noah. By the way, I'm a dinosaur too. And each of us has our own, dinosaur influence that we need to sort of grapple with. And that also connects to this issue of assessment, because it's also instructor self-assessment and
Right.
so on. I just wanted to add, like, something that's come up as a theme recently is like the idea of reading the room. And so with admin, it's like figuring out, what does it appear that they are most concerned with? So like, because I used to teach high school in a charter school, and everything was, get into college, and we have to get them on the track to college. So like maybe framing it in terms of, this will help them X, Y, and Z in college, or getting into college, or in their future coursework. I don't know.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think this is part of the appeal here. Is it is really focused on building a student outside of your classroom and building skills that will help them outside of your classroom, and not just memorizing things inside of it and then them losing it. So I think, as you said, it's a lot of the way you talk about it, and finding the right kind of words that work for them is probably what you need to kind of focus on for sure.
Yeah, and if I can jump, absolutely agree with that. So it's about having those clear outcomes. So if the school has outcomes, you can also have outcomes for your own course. And we've had, so there's webinars and slides about that, about creating outcomes for your course. So it's just as Noah is saying, like being very conversant and being able to, unfortunately, defend yourself when you have to, and say, these are my outcomes, or meeting their outcomes. This is a course outline of record. These are this is this, I'm doing this. Here's how everything fits. And really making sure that you can defend what you're doing and show that the outcomes are being met. Because I think that's what a lot of administrators are very interested in. Are you meeting outcomes? Are you just in here winging it for no reason? And I mean, just from personal experience, that is what I have had to like fight for. And hearing a dean say, "Oh, so your essays build upon each other and they're scaffolded," I'm like, yes, duh. And it felt like this was news to him, that you could scaffold your essays and make them all kind of build on each other. So yeah, for me, it's, as Noah has said, just being very conversant in what you're doing and being able to throw out your outcomes or your alignment with the course outline of record, and winning that argument. So sorry, but I think that's part of the game.
I think the biggest thing that admin would think when they first hear about this is just they think that the students are picking their grade. So I think that's the one point that really has to be clear for everyone, is that the students aren't just getting to pick an A and then move on. And I think that's the biggest misconception with this type of method. So I think start there and then have all of the documentation that Catherine was talking about. Yeah, for sure. Great question though.
Yeah.
I mean, I just feel like it's also, again, reading the room, it's like that person, the admin, may have a million things on their list. So they're like, no, this isn't going to work. And just let's not even have that conversation. And what each of you, and then all of you together, are pointing to is like, but here it is. Here are the receipts. And I'm not making your life more difficult, and you won't have more work to do for yourself, Mr. Admin Man. I'm not against admin. I'm like all for admin. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they have their own outcomes that they need to meet.
Yeah.
So, and Noah, Derek has a question. What age group do you think this can be implemented most effectively?
From the research I've looked at, it's mostly been utilized in college students. That isn't to say that it can't be utilized amongst other age groups. So I don't know exactly. I know, as someone who's taught in colleges, I haven't had to deal with anyone bothering me if I were to try this approach. And since it's so metacognitive in nature, I could imagine it being better for older students. But I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest with you.
Here, I'll jump in. During a time when I thought I was going to teach high school, I was observing a high school classroom and I think they were 11th grade, and she was teaching English, and she did something like this, and it inspired me to do the same thing. She gave the students a set of essays, and they were all in charge of ranking it in the same way that like placement tests or essay tests are evaluated when you sit at a table and you have a norming session and you figure out which ones are passing, not passing. So she did that process with her students so they could see what kind of a grade this type of writing would get, or what kind of a grade this type of writing would get. So it had nothing to do with their own essays, but getting them to evaluate representative models, as Noah was saying earlier. So I think, there's versions of it that can be used so that they can also look at their own work and say, okay, how does it match up to what we just did in class? So I think there's ways to implement it in smaller ways. Maybe not so heavily like, okay, evaluate your whole essay, but maybe aspects of their essays, like, evaluate your use of this kind of language, or evaluate one paragraph, maybe in smaller chunks, as we were talking about, as we saw earlier.
Yeah, and also just to, now that I'm thinking about it, since the level of exposure is kind of so influential in the process here, I would imagine students that just have more experience with a topic, this works better for that group. Not to say that you couldn't use it for younger groups, but it's going to be more teacher driven in people with less exposure to the topic. Yeah, thank you for the question.
The counter argument to that is that in introducing this to younger students will sort of possibly make it grow, and they can share, and like it's just this bigger thing over time. But I agree with you that for what you just said, yeah.
Yeah, no, I would love to see this implemented everywhere, but yeah. So that's all I have. Feel free to stick around. If not, thank you for attending. I really appreciate the great questions a lot. Thank you for those. And definitely come to a few of these workshops coming up. Thank you.
Noah, you were talking about the differences in agreement between students and the professor for introductory level classes versus like a capstone class. That also made me think about the criteria development process, or involving students in the process. I'm just thinking, for introductory level classes, is it finessed differently? Because I would think in those classes, students might be looking a little bit more to the professor to have everything established for them, because they're not really sure what a good assignment is for that topic.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think just in intro courses, you're going to have to spend a lot more time on defining terms, defining what success looks like. So it becomes just, you're devoting a lot more of your resources talking about, they need a knowledge base to even get to that second part of it. So you have to spend more time building that knowledge base. So if you go at the same pace for an intro course and a capstone course, well, the intro kids are going to be left behind a little because they're not going to have that knowledge base to lean on. Thank you for attending, Melanie.
That being said, I think that this can be used successfully in an intro class, not for like the whole class, but for some assignments. Like an intro to psych class, I can see this being used on, if they're writing a research paper, which many intro classes require. I can see them using this for like their methods section, or their introduction section, so that they can, even something as simple as giving them checklists and then walking through the checklist with them, I think could be pretty helpful, so that they can self-assess themselves as they go. Because
Right.
those can be pretty standard, like what goes in an intro, for those types of
Yeah, yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. That is not to say that it can't be utilized in those classes. It just takes a different mindset going in.
So I guess you just have to be really transparent about it so your students feel safe. Like it's not like you're developing the class as it goes, you're just involving them in the process. Or like I saw one of your options was you have like a menu of things that your students can choose from.
Yeah, and transparency is going to be a theme regardless, but definitely with students that are very new to the material. Absolutely. And never assuming that they know what this term means or that term means. Like constantly being transparent all the time.